was a challenge. The events, it wasn't so much the meetings, George, it was the social events. They were geared towards men, and there were just some tough fits once in a while.
"40 Years of the Business Journal" is sponsored by Compco and these participating sponsors.
I had a degree in accounting from Ohio State, and when we moved here after graduation, my husband was a native of this area and he had a job. And so I came up here looking for a job. Was unable to find one because in 1975, that's when the beginning of the steel industry demise, and autos were tough then. The energy crisis had just occurred. And so I was having a tough time finding a job, and Martin Chevrolet ran an ad for a business manager to handle financing. And I had a degree in finance, so I applied for the job. I didn't get it, but was subsequently called back to hire to interview to be an office manager trainee because of my degree in accounting. The main changes have been the complexity of the automobiles, how the engines and the powertrain, everything is driven by computers. Repairing the automobiles is so different than it used to be. The pricing has, of course, there's inflation pricing, but the automobiles have become so much more expensive because the consumers have wanted so much more. In 1984, maybe some cars had power windows and locks, but a lot of them didn't. There were still standard transmissions that were available. Radios had cassette players and were maybe transitioning to CDs. But you look at a car back then and it's nothing like the car we have right now. It was a very gradual transition. It began even in the 80s when we were buying machines at the time that cost $20,000 to scope the engines out. It began with that, and they had to be trained in the use of those machines. And then more and more, we would get tools from the factory that we would connect to the cars, and then we would have to read the finding on a computer. To now, every tech has a computer at their workstation.
What kind of training does a tech need to go through now?
It's very extensive, and it is based on degree of specialties. There's basic technician training across the board for things like brakes and rotors and wheels and oil changes, but then it goes, as you get in your specificities, into transmissions or engines, or there's a whole training course for EVs right now that is different than any of the other training. What has happened in this community? I started thinking about 1984 and how different being a car dealer in 1984 was compared to now. Packard Electric was still very visible in our community with, I believe, 9,000 employees at the time. The Lordstown plant was still open, manufacturing. 1984, I think they were just gearing up for the Cavalier. I think that came out in 85, maybe. That I'd have to double check for sure.
And the van plant was still operating out there.
So there were 15, at peak employment, it was 15,000 employees there. Republic Steel sold to LTV in 1984, so that was very viable. Copper weld steel was still in business, and a number of smaller plants were still around, like the Ohio lamp plant. Then you think about the downtown, there were 4 major banks that had a presence: Union Savings and Trust, Second National Bank, Trumbull Savings and Loan, and First Federal. And they all had huge presence in the town area, multiple floors of employees working. The telephone company had a call center there. I think they had 70 or 80 employees that worked at their call center. So it just was such a different world than it is today. Some people were very friendly to me. Some had, through the years, got to know me as I was general manager.
Yeah.
So started attending some of the functions as general manager of the dealership. So they got to know me.
Yeah.
It was a challenge. The events, it wasn't so much the meetings, George, it was the social events. They were geared towards men, and there were just some tough fits once in a while.
Has it improved significantly, would you say?
Oh, yes, definitely. One thing I was thinking about was the interest rate environment in 1984. In the very early 80s, prime had reached 20%, and it had really been difficult to do business in that area. I looked up today, prime in 1984 vacillated between 11.5% and 13%. That means consumer rates to those people who had very good credit were 15, 16, 17%. People today, now that our interest rates have gone up to 8%, they think that's awful, but it's like it was double that in 1984. I remember Union Savings and Trust did a program where they had a special rate of 15.9%. And it was like 0% financing from the manufacturers. People were so excited and came in and bought cars because it was only 15.9%. That was a very critical area of doing business in 1984 and navigating through that cost of money, both on what the consumers had to pay and what the dealerships had to pay for the cost of their loans for financing automobiles and any loans they may have had. That was a huge difference. I think an important part of the community is good schools. And while Warren still has a way to go, I think we've seen some improvement over the last few years. That definitely has to happen. Trumbull Neighborhood Partnership has been a very positive force on this area with getting rid of the blighted homes and real estate and buildings in the area. That makes Warren look more attractive. The secret is very simple, but yet very difficult, and there has to be prosperity. There has to be jobs. People have to be able to afford to buy a home and live in the community.
"40 Years of the Business Journal" is sponsored by Compco and these participating sponsors.